I am resolved to die. I have reached my appointed term and must sacrifice myself. For thee. There are few pains as potent as true heartbreak, when the person you love looks you dead in the eye and tells you they don't want you in the way that you want them. Your soul plummets into your stomach and your world spins. You wonder how you'll be able to endure life in this state. A cavalcade of questions strikes your mind. How long will this last? Will it get any better? Will I ever find love again? Well, in the late 18th century, the German poet, philosopher, and author Johann Goethe was pondering these very same questions. He penned a work that is perhaps the most honest and insightful exploration of love and heartbreak I have ever read. It is called The Sorrows of Young Werther, and today we shall explore its depths to uncover what lies within. Spoilers ahead. The story follows our young protagonist named Werther and how he falls in love with a young woman called Charlotte, who is in turn betrothed to marry a very admirable man called Albert. We see this love triangle from the perspective of Werther as he's writing letters to a friend of his, and we observe how Charlotte's rejection slowly tears Werther apart. He simply cannot find meaning without her, and he eventually ends his own life using one of Albert's pistols. Get ready to learn why chasing happiness is much more fun than getting it, how love can amplify the best and worst aspects of life, and so much more. Now, remember that this is just my perspective on the novel, and it is one account of heartbreak amongst many. If your experience is a difference, that is absolutely fine. But with that out of the way, let's get started. 1. Forbidden fruit. A little known fact is that the ancient Greek philosopher Plato invented negging. I am exaggerating a little, but in the Symposium he advises one of his friends not to shower his lover with affection, but instead to hold him at a distance, so that their intense erotic desire can be maintained. He said, "It is on the boundary of having and not having someone that our hearts become truly inflamed." And he is hardly the only person to have pointed this out. We see it everywhere, from the intense passion of illicit affairs to the advice to treat him mean to keep him keen. There is something about being in this liminal space between security and abandonment that drives us mad with want. And we see this illustrated perfectly in The Sorrows of Young Werther. Charlotte is, from the very beginning of the novel, unavailable to Werther's advances. The first thing we are told is that Charlotte is engaged to Albert, and Werther is explicitly warned not to fall for her. But this does not deter him at all. Instead of making her a less attractive prospect, all it does is heighten her allure. It leaves open a tantalizing story for Werther to tell himself, that Charlotte really loves him, not Albert. And it's only mere social convention that keeps them apart. Indeed, this is how some people choose to interpret the novel. But I see things in a slightly different light. I think Charlotte's position as Werther's close friend and confidant, but also as someone engaged and then married to someone else, places her in the perfect spot for Werther's obsession to take hold. Their relationship then becomes this intoxicating mix of push and pull. With one hand, Charlotte is definitely pulling Werther in, since they are friends and she cares about him deeply, even if it's only in a platonic way. But on the other, she romantically distances herself from him. She is married to Albert, and she makes it clear to Werther that she would never betray her husband. But from Werther's perspective, it is just when he has almost given up hope that he receives another crumb of attention, keeping him hooked to Charlotte like a drug. For her part, Charlotte does not do this out of malice. She can't understand why Werther has become so distressed over this cycle. But when we're privy to his letters, it's not hard to see things through Werther's eyes as well. For Werther, Charlotte has almost immediately become the sole source of meaning in his life, for reasons that we will get into later. This means she is his place of comfort, the person he goes to when things go wrong. But at the same time, it is her lack of erotic love for him that drives his distress. Werther becomes caught in this vicious circle where he feels unmoored without the presence of Charlotte. But her presence is a continual reminder of his sorry state. In some schools of psychology, this is called disordered attachment, and it's almost guaranteed to bring someone to the brink of despair. It is a heartbreak that occurs not with a singular blow, but with 1,000 tiny cuts. I'm sure we can recognize this pattern either from our own lives or from the lives of people we've known. Have you ever been in a situation where the very person you turn to when you are upset is the cause of your pain? Or where you perceive just enough attention from someone that it keeps you attached to them year after year? You have neither the security to abandon them completely nor the good fortune to secure them as a partner. If so, you have been in the shoes of our young protagonist. And I love how this dynamic does not emerge through some villainy on Charlotte's part, but rather an unfortunate mix of circumstances and feelings. Towards the end of the novel, Charlotte delivers to Werther the following insightful thought. She says, I fear it is only the impossibility of possessing me that makes your desire for me so strong. And there is some evidence for this in the novel. At one point, Werther briefly moves away from the town Charlotte lives in and strikes up a dalliance with another woman, who seems to genuinely love him. But he throws this all away because of his obsession with Charlotte. Werther is someone who is addicted to the chase, addicted to longing itself, but only under the delusion that it will one day be fulfilled. He can neither be happy in a stable love nor with solitude, but his joy exists on the cusp of companionship, and he lives entirely from hope to hope. When he finally realizes that there is no chance for success, none at all, his heart shatters. Many of us will have fallen into this trap ourselves. I know I have. And the heightened emotional state of Werther can make us more aware of these anticipatory cycles in our own lives, and where they might be slowly driving us mad. And this can only happen because of Charlotte's tantalizing status as a love that can never truly be. But we have yet to move on to the meat and potatoes of Goethe's examination of love, how it can affect our view on the world. Luckily, that's just what we're going to move on to next. If you want to help me make more videos like this, then consider subscribing to either my email list or my Patreon. The links are in the description. 2. The magnifying glass. Western philosophers have historically really demonized the passions. Plato thought of them as dangerous, destabilizing forces that could bring a civilization to its knees. The Stoics rejected them as irrational and chaotic. And while Leibniz thought that loving in accordance with wisdom was admirable, erotic love was still considered a stepping stone on the path to sin and self-destruction. This is part of what makes Goethe's treatment of passionate affection so refreshingly nuanced in this landmark novel. When Werther falls for Charlotte, his love essentially works as a magnifying factor for all of his sensations. In one touching passage, he describes how nature seems more vibrant, more pleasant, how he even feels closer to God. His ecstasy is palpable and contagious, and it's almost like he has forgotten the very concept of sadness. While he can maintain his belief that one day he and Charlotte will be united, his world becomes a paradise. But when his fantasies shatter and he comes back down to earth, he goes from one extreme to the other. The colour drains from the world, and he says he can't find a reason to go on. He falls straight from ecstasy to despair, with the added momentum making the impact all the more painful. In one particularly poignant example of this, Werther stirs from his sleep and briefly believes that Charlotte is lying next to him. But when he realises that this was just a dream, his joy turns bitter in his mouth, and disappointment fills the void. And in some ways, this is in line with how a lot of ancient Greek thinkers conceived of eros. Eros is the Greek word for passionate erotic love, and they conceived of it as a powerful and unpredictable force. In many myths, it causes the extremes of both happiness and misery. In the tale of Cupid and Psyche, a beautiful young woman falls for the spirit of love himself, and it initially causes her to leap for joy. She seems high with excitement and is totally sustained by the strength of her own feeling. But when Venus snatches Cupid from her, Psyche is distraught. She even willingly plunges into the underworld itself, if only it will assuage her pain and Venus will grant her back her love. Here, Eros becomes a sort of magnifying glass for the world. Every positive shines brighter, but anything that threatens to separate the enraptured lovers becomes unbearable. This is part of what can make intense love so bittersweet. It is almost like gambling. Passion is putting all of your chips in and risking everything. While you are winning, it is amazing. You feel like you'll never come down from this emotional summit. But the moment you start to lose, it's like reality itself is crashing down around you. And in painting passionate love this way, Goethe presents us with a choice. Do we give in to Eros and accept the mountains and valleys of our emotional states? Or do we reject it for a safer path? One that is calmer, gentler, perhaps more stoic, but is robbed of the great heights that a passionate life can grant you. One of Nietzsche's great criticisms of extreme stoicism, that in preventing us from suffering, it also dulled the fire of life entirely. He thought of it as a fundamentally ascetic philosophy, and wrote that if we limited our emotional range in either direction, then we'd only ever have half of our existence. In his landmark text, Either Or, Kierkegaard presents two ways of living: the aesthetic man, who accepts the highs and lows of a passionate life, or the ethical man, who smooths them out in service to more stable values. The balance of these factors is a decision we are continually making throughout our entire lives. But in love specifically, do we have a choice at all? Isn't it more like passion takes us entirely unawares? Cupid carries a bow and arrow, not a contract for us to sign. If we are truly hit by the slings of Eros, won't we just Give in? After all, this is what happens with Werther. He begins the novel praising calmness and tranquility and prizing solitude. He goes into his first interaction with Charlotte without the faintest idea that he will fall for her. But only a few hours later, he is head over heels. And the rest of the novel highlights this conflict in his mind as his rational self desperately tries to dislodge the arrow of love. It is revealed to be barbed, and each futile tug only rips more holes in his wounded heart. I personally think we have some limited freedom when it comes to love. We can't control who we fall in love with, but we can control what we do once we have it. Do we choose to feed passion with no hope of fulfillment, or do we find the strength to cut them off, returning to our island of solitude until we find romance again? But on the other hand, we surely don't want to dull our passions entirely, or else our love will become completely pedestrian, and we may not want that. These are questions of how to live that I won't pretend to have the answers to, but I think it's worth confronting them directly, rather than leaving their resolution up to chance. But why does Eros have this extreme effect on us? Well, to answer this, we need to ask a profound and yet totally everyday question. What is so special about other people? 3. The self, the other, and unity. The mathematician and philosopher Blaise Pascal once said that all of mankind's problems stem from our inability to sit alone in a room in silence. But this observation has not lessened our need for other people one bit. It is cliché to say it, but we are social animals, and there's a reason why solitary confinement is considered torture. Without the presence of other minds, we slowly begin to lose our own. We hallucinate, our perception of time is distorted, and we undergo unimaginable mental distress. The causes for this are numerous and varied, and I obviously can't go into them now. But from a philosophical perspective, part of it seems to be our yearning to unify with other people and to blur our identities with theirs. The psychoanalyst Harry Sullivan used to emphasize this role that others had in shaping our self-conception. He used the term self-system to refer to the way our web of relationships and connections create and alter our identities, especially when we are young. Rather than searching for human motivations purely in terms of instinctual drives, Sullivan emphasized how we seek security in these interpersonal relationships and how this fear of being abandoned can be almost as powerful as that of running out of food or losing our shelter. There is perhaps no better example of this urge to unify than the character of Werther. He begins the novel with the general wish to become one with something greater than himself. Initially, this drive is directed towards God and nature, and he enjoys the solitude of his retreat. He says he has a calm and gentle joy about the world, and this is the closest we see him to being at peace. Of course, this all changes the minute he meets Charlotte. Then she becomes the object of his unifying need. He fantasizes about how she would complete him and how they would live their days in bliss and harmony. He begins to resent Albert for all the times he is grumpy or irritated around Charlotte. From Werther's perspective, Albert is living in heaven, and he interprets any human emotional wavering as damnable ingratitude. At this point, it is clear Charlotte has become something more than a person in the eyes of Werther. She has become almost like an existential need, and I think we're all on some level familiar with this feeling. When we are very young, our parents just are such a need. Without them, we would die, and we treat them accordingly. But this often rears its head in later romantic relationships as well. The object of our affections becomes an avatar for everything we perceive to be lacking in our own lives. Charlotte is not just a charming young woman to Werther, but she will confirm that he is wanted, that his life has meaning. It is tempting to dismiss Werther here as being essentially childish, and there is some element of that. But I think we are probably more like him than we realize. How many of us can say that we are truly self-sufficient, that our conceptions of who we are is never shaped by other people? I certainly can't, and I don't think there's many people who can. There is some logic behind dubbing our partners our other half. It expresses the importance of an interpersonal connection to a satisfying, fulfilling life, at least for most people. Too often, we treat the idea of love as if it was something unimportant, something to get round to eventually. But for a lot of people, finding and keeping love feels like something of divine significance. Who we spend our life with will be one of the most important decisions we ever make for our long-term happiness. And when we put on this lens, Werther's despair becomes more understandable and palatable. He is experiencing a heightened version of something that many of us feel deep down: the terror of being permanently alone, without the web of connections that are so vital to our continued development and joy. However, things are more complicated than this. Ellis Dye has pointed out that Werther's urge to unify is balanced by another, the urge to separate. As his attachment to Charlotte grows stronger, he ends up resenting it quite powerfully. He has moments of treating her like this cosmic force that he loathes being entangled with. Just as something inside him yearns to be with her, another part of him yearns for independence. In his own words, "I sometimes cannot understand how she dares love another, when I love nothing in this world so completely as I love her." This bubbling resentment is part of what catches Werther in this constant cycle of being upset by Charlotte's rejection, saying that he will never see her again, becoming dejected without her, and then running back. It is like the disordered attachment we were talking about earlier, but this time on a more existential level. Werther is caught in a living contradiction between his urge to separate from Charlotte and his urge to unify with her. This is part of how he rationalizes his quite senseless suicide at the end of the novel. Whether Werther believes in heaven or oblivion, he thinks he'll be in the same place that Charlotte will go to, eventually. And he also willingly gives up his own personhood in the process. Thus, he can resolve these twin urges to unify and separate in one fell swoop. It's part of how this immensely self-destructive decision makes sense from his perspective, in a twisted kind of way. And many of us feel the tension between our own urges to unify with other people and maintain our independence in our own lives. So perhaps it's best to examine the role that these forces play for us, and where they are leading to distress in our own relationships. But there are still more dimensions of Werther's heartbreak to examine, and our next one is perhaps the most troublingly recognizable. 4. Anger and indignation. We have already talked a little bit about how Charlotte's rejection of Werther causes him to harbour anger and resentment for her, but here I want to explore it in more detail, because it is a tendency that many of us are prone to a certain extent, and if we indulge it, it can make the process of heartbreak all the more difficult. The seeds of Werther's anger are planted by his conviction that he would make a better match for Charlotte than Albert. Since the whole book is told from Werther's perspective, we have no idea if he's right or not, but it's at the very least plausible. Albert is honourable and kind and loyal, but Werther and Charlotte have an emotional bond that she just does not seem to share with her husband. Charlotte and Werther are totally at ease in one another's company, and have been brought together purely by natural affection, without a single thought for what is societally acceptable or encouraged. Perhaps the only reason that Werther and Albert are able to strike up a friendship near the beginning of the novel is that Werther doesn't really see Albert as an emotional rival. It is not until much later that it truly sinks in for our young protagonist that he and Charlotte will never be. But once he finally does realise this fact, Charlotte's entanglement with her husband becomes not a temporary obstacle, but instead a divine injustice. Werther firmly believes that he and Charlotte are meant to be together, and his inability to let go of this belief fuels his continual resentment. First, he turns it on Albert. He begins to see Charlotte's husband as the author of his suffering. If only Albert were not there, then he and Charlotte could be united. Since he sees Charlotte and himself as destined to be in some nebulous way, this turns Albert not just into an obstacle, but into an outright villain in Werther's eyes. He is perverting the intended course of the universe by keeping these two lovebirds apart. At least that is how Werther sees things. He gradually distances himself from Albert, and in doing so also pushes Charlotte away. This is the first step to his final downward spiral and eventual self-destruction. Of course, Charlotte and Albert are baffled. They have no idea that this is how Werther's begun to see the world. And it only gets worse, because next his resentment comes to rest on Charlotte herself. Werther harbours this subtle entitlement to her feelings that turns his own mind against her. Either he believes that she genuinely loves him, but just is not brave enough to break with social expectations and leave her husband, or he thinks she has cruelly spurned his selfless passion. In either case, he views what she has done to not just be unpleasant, but in some way unfair. He sees the strength of his own feelings as conferring upon her special duties. He interprets any sign of friendship as her carelessly building up his hopes, but then he takes each rejection as a pointed attack. It's very damned if you do, damned if you don't. This torments him inside, and his meetings with Charlotte turn into chaotic outbursts of love and dejection. This, understandably, only makes Charlotte want to distance herself from him. In the end, Werther's boiling mix of fury and envy towards both Albert and Charlotte means that he rarely sees them anymore. Charlotte becomes deeply conflicted about Werther's mounting instability, and Albert begins to see him as a madman who's upsetting his wife. In one final visit to Charlotte's house, Werther reads her some poetry, and overcome with emotion, he rushes to kiss her. But Charlotte has finally had enough. She rejects his advances and throws him out of the house, saying that she never wants to see him again. The next night, Werther ends his own life. And when it is laid out like this, we can see how much of Werther's inner torture is caused by his own behavior. If he had managed to dispel his belief that he and Charlotte were somehow cosmically defined to be together, then he might have slowly been able to chip away at his upset. He could put this whole affair behind him and move on with his life, maybe find someone else. But it is this idea that a great injustice has been done, leading to his ever-rising rage, which prevents him from making peace with his situation. In one deeply disturbing scene, Werther even defends a man who has murdered his own lover, on the grounds that he, just like Werther, was overcome with amorous rage. It is a terrifying yet touchingly human reaction. When we have our heart broken, it is so easy to fall into these traps of thinking that a destined future has been robbed from us, that the natural order of things has been disrupted, that this was just not how it was meant to be. But perhaps the character of Werther here can give us twin comforts. First, he can remind us that feeling this way is, to a certain extent, perfectly normal. We need not be ashamed of it. But secondly, he can give us a stark reminder of where such a path will lead us in the long term. This faux righteous indignation may strike us unawares, but it's our choice whether we continuously feed it or slowly learn to let it go. But lastly, I want to talk about the final pages of the book and how Werther's obsession with Charlotte and his own romantic love made him blind to how much he had to live for. 5. Forgotten loves. In the last scene of the novel, Werther has shot himself and is either very close to death or already dead. We are reading the account of an investigator, piecing together the facts of Werther's final days. And it is touching to see just what people's reactions are. First, Charlotte falls into grief. She collapses, and the investigator says that her life was despaired of. She clearly deeply cared for Werther and loved him, just not in the way he wanted. Albert is also described as deeply distressed. He clearly saw Werther as a friend. And even if they had recently fallen out, losing him causes Albert immense pain. But we are also told about the reaction of the old steward. This is a minor figure in the novel, and one that Werther barely mentions. Yet the old steward embraces Werther's dying body with tears, and all of his children do the same. In Goethe's own words, in speechless sorrow, they threw themselves on their knees by the bedside and kissed his hands and face. When I first read this passage, I genuinely started crying, because it represents perhaps the most tragic aspect of Werther's life. He truly was loved. He was loved by Charlotte, by Albert, and even by people he didn't seem to pay much mind to. Here were all these souls who deeply valued and cared for him, and yet he could not see it. He was so captured by his obsessive love for Charlotte that he did not notice the vibrant, multicolored palette of love that was right in front of him. He was loved as a brother, as a friend, as a confidant, as a companion. One day he'd probably be loved as a romantic partner too, just by someone else. People truly valued him for who he was. But Werther was so caught up in this singular eros that he forgot all the other kinds of love that the Greeks used to talk about. He forgot philia, friendly love, agape, selfless love, and philautia, or healthy self-love. And I think there is a potent message in here for us all. Despite what I said earlier about passion being demonized as childish, romantic love is placed on a pedestal above everything else in our modern age. And there is some sense in this. As I said, it can be a huge component to a satisfying life, and people seek it out for perfectly good reasons. But we should be careful that romance does not shine so bright that we miss all of the other wellsprings of love that are out there. If our heart has been broken by rejected eros, we don't need to think that love itself has left us. It is just one face of a complex and multifaceted phenomenon, and we can take comfort and fulfillment in its other aspects, even when the fiery spirit of eros is nowhere to be found. Even when we no longer have a lover and it feels like our heart has been irreparably ripped in two, we can still find powerful love. And if you want to explore some of these ideas about the philosophy of romance further, then click here to explore one of Dostoevsky's most famous love tales. And stick around for more on thinking to improve your life.